Welcome to another recorded Aftershock, midweek Aftershock. Hopefully, you will enjoy this one. I'm really excited about the two guys that we have on the show here. One of them we've had on before, Carpenter, and joining us today for the first time, I believe, on the Aftershock is Kieran Doyle. How you doing, guys?
Great. How you doing?
Yeah, terrific.
Good. So, Carl, you're a tactical and video analyst for StatsBomb. Tactics are a part of your job title, and we want to talk about the tactics today. Kieran is a college coach in the Toronto area, and he's someone who observes Chelsea FC in the English Premier League, as well as obviously Toronto FC in MLS. And being a college coach and a Canada B license, also someone who cares deeply about the tactics and can give us some perspectives about what we saw on the pitch. And it's going to be relevant to Chelsea here as well. And we'll talk about that in just a bit. So, Carl, give me just a very quick, what did you see in the game? I believe you watched the full game and wanted to get your impressions of, kind of the overall a tactical approach that Matias Almeida had in this game.
Yeah, so it did seem to be kind of obviously Quakes fans are kind of familiar with the kind of all the buzzwords that Almeida kind of brings to his style of play. But it was kind of Almeida ball turned up to 11. So Kieran will get into kind of more of it in terms of the attacking stuff, but a lot of the transitions and moments were, pretty familiar to Quakes fans throughout the years, but it even seemed that the 1v1 duels that are kind of imperative of Almeida ball in terms of the defensive zonal marking man-to-man marking and defensive style were also kind of evident in terms of their build-up patterns. So really wide center backs playing Jackson Ewell basically by himself in the center. It made them a lot harder to kind of progress the ball. And I think Matt Doyle in his column basically talked about how the Red Bulls last year were one of the crossiest teams in MLS. They didn't even need to cross because of how much space there was. It just, there's open space, basically use it. Kind of reminded me of a game last season or the season before, I believe, away at Seattle when Jordan Morris and company kind of ran riot against the Quakes. It was pretty much that for 90 minutes.
All right, let me get myself back together here. All right. Sorry, the video was hanging up there a little bit. Kieran, you didn't get to see the full game. You got to see the kind of extended highlight package on the game, but you probably thereby saw most of the things that were interesting about the game. Give us some of your perspective about what you saw in that extended highlight package.
Yeah, I think, again, we kind of spoke about the game, and so I watched that longer package, and then I was looking for specific clips in terms of the build-up and stuff, and I think what we saw for good and for bad was a lot of the things that Almeida has tried to do his whole tenure in San Jose. And kind of what we'll talk about later when we talk about the Chelsea-specific things is we saw kind of a poor imitation of some of the things that the very possession-heavy 3-4-3 teams in Europe are trying to do in terms of making the pitch super wide with their wingbacks and stretching it vertically, so you have all the space to play in almost big duels inside with your center midfielders, and we'll kind of show what some of that looks like. But I think when we're talking about the roster that the Quakes have, we maybe have to get into at some point whether that's the best way to play for those players.
Okay, so let's go ahead and get into it. We have prepared some stills here, just for the sake of working within probably copyright limitations and such. It's a little bit of the easier approach to do. So, Carl, you've provided 5 different moments, and these are from both positive and negative rest defense situations.
Yeah.
So clearly, rest defense is an area that you saw a lot of concerns in. Can you introduce, each one and kind of orient us to what's going on at this particular moment and what it is that you think the Quakes didn't do as well as they should have, and what maybe they could do in order to correct this situation going forward.
Yeah, so kind of just to kind of sum up, rest defense is essentially the defensive structure that you have when you're actually attacking in the ball to prevent and provide assurances for defensive transitions. It's sort of, I call it the safety net in terms of your in possession structure. So this picture here is actually a kind of a positive example. I believe that's Cade Cal in the center who loses possession from the Red Bull player. And as you can see, you have two players. You have basically, the good defensive structures always provide a numerical advantage in terms of how you're going to defend transitions here. So you can see here, the highest player is the highlighted player close to, I believe that's Calvo at the bottom there. He's basically linked up and he's marking him. And then you have the right center back there who's free and to kind of provide cover. So this is a good example. Immediate possession of the ball. Obviously, the players around it in the immediate vicinity will counter press to make it harder for them to kind of leave that congested area. But what actually happens here in this play, obviously we don't have the video for it, is the ball is played forward and this player who's free here is able to kind of sweep and cover. So that's actually a positive example of the kind of the earthquake structure here.
And if fans want to go back and look at some of these situations in a bit more detail to see things for themselves, they can take note of the timestamp at the upper left corner of the screen here from the Red Bulls broadcast. Okay.
Yeah.
Great. So the next moment we've got here is a negative situation. This one is about 17 minutes, into the game. So Nathan is still in the game at this point, and it felt like in the first 25 minutes or so, I can't remember exactly when Nathan got hurt. It was a little bit before the 25-minute mark, I believe, that the Quakes were doing a fairly decent job. And would you guys agree with the way that the game played out, that the more positive moments for the Quakes in this system came in those early minutes of the game, and then things tended to get more negative almost as the game went on. Trophies had that set piece goal, but that kind of came out of nowhere as a set piece, and there really wasn't a lot of positives beyond the 25 minutes from the attacking side. So, Carl, with that in mind here, this is our first kind of negative situation, and maybe our first clue that things aren't going to work well in the transitions.
Yeah, so what happened actually in this play here is the Quakes actually do a good job of pressing, and they force the Red Bulls back to Cornell, the goalkeeper. Cornell basically essentially hoofs it down the field. The player wins a flick on, and the ball basically creates a huge gap in the back there. And this is basically just the basic inability from the Quakes players to, make sure that they're aware. And that requires constantly remarking, checking shoulders, and being aware of players around you, and just knowing, where the spaces are. So all it requires is, and it's kind of a consistent thing with the Quakes, as we'll kind of get forward to in the transition, is losing their 1v1 duel. So the player loses the flick on here, and because of the poor defensive, rest defense structure, the Red Bulls player, the forward there, is able to kind of get onto a loose ball. A situation which should be, an easy chance for the Quakes to, keep the ball at least in the opposition's half, or regain and start the build-up pattern again. It turns into a transitional moment. So that's based off, obviously, the defensive structure in terms of the Quakes throwing numbers forward and the wingbacks getting really high and kind of leaving those duels there. But it's also an individual issue in terms of players just, even if they did have defensive structure, this kind of inability to pick up a mark and know who's around you is a failure on the center backs and the defenders itself.
I can't tell if that's Nathan or Grey Goose there. That's a bit central. It's a little bit too grainy to tell. But would you prefer that they be sitting a little bit further back, since you already have a mark that's looks like that they've been able to take care of the 9 in that situation? It feels to me like there should be more central coverage from both defenders there.
Yeah, I think one of the big things here is it's obviously a still image, so it's not a kind of a great barometer for this, but is you don't want, usually in these kind of defensive structures, you want the free player to either be, deeper to kind of add, and they're basically on the same line here, which means that basically any kind of straight run in behind is going to create a dilemma for players to who to pick up, and especially the run across the defenders in terms of, switching players and all that kind of stuff. If you kind of have good rest defensive structures, always have some kind of semblance of depth in terms of how they're playing. And there is just because it's a simple flick on, it's it's not a driven ball from Cornell, so they should basically have some time to kind of one show, one drop off, that kind of thing. They basically are just ball watching and watching the player lose the flick on, and from there it's a relatively easy. I believe here actually Nathan actually makes like a really good recovery tackle to kind of prevent it, but for like 3 or 4 seconds it's a 1v1
right.
with the center back and the Red Bulls center forward whose name escapes me, but yeah.
Something the Quakes do have a bit in spades are people who are capable of making those recovery tackles, but they tempt fate too often.
Yeah, I think I clipped about 8 minutes of those transitional moments from the game. And I think a lot of those, like 6 of them, were just like players making like really good recovery tackles, which you don't want. You're worried if that happens twice a match. If it happens consistently, 4 or 5 times and a half, it's not
a little bit much, a little bit tempting fate too much, I think.
Yeah,
there.
Exactly. Yeah.
All right, so we got our next positive moment here. This is at the looks like maybe this is right after Nathan got hurt, so yes. Maybe Beeson's in the game at this point. But Carl, go ahead and introduce the situation here.
Yeah, so it's sort of a similar situation of a player losing a duel and then essentially an easy chance for a transitional moment. It's not from a long ball. It's from, I believe Yule he loses a tackle and I think he thinks
he's complaining for a foul.
He's fouled there. But what you see here is that the Quakes actually have good advantage in numbers. Like, even though they do have 3 attacking players higher up the pitch, which was more than the previous example, they do have, you have a 4v3 in terms of the favor of the Quakes. So the players who aren't actually actively involved in terms of following runners and following marks, they're actually just able to kind of drop into space and cover those areas. So even if, the player who's being marked is able to kind of run free, you do have that extra kind of depth and assurances in terms of providing depth, which you didn't have in the last one. And these are the kind of, good rest defensive structures always have these kind of, extra assurances. You can't rely on, there's no good defensive structure which is going to have 2v2 in this kind of moments. It's just not ideal. Defensively, you always want to have at least +1 in the back. And this is kind of a good example of that.
Or as a coach, would you be okay, both of you really, because Kieran, you're a college coach here. Would you be okay with Yule in that situation, looking for the foul, or should he, just immediately get back into the game? Because it just feels to me like they could be in a better situation if he immediately drops and then comes back later and talks. I think Drew Fisher was the referee, comes back later and addresses it with Fisher, after the fact. Are you okay for players to ask for a foul in that situation like that?
So, I mean, it's fairly cynical and like, obviously you'd rather players just accept it and recover in transition. But I think this is why we start to see so many players take the gamble of when they get fouled, they drop and they grab the ball. And it's the referee's they might give a handball, but at least now it's a set position. So you can recover.
It's a dead ball either way.
You really get countered. Yeah. And so it's, maybe you force the referee into a decision, but
it's gonna take a brave referee to call in that situation, call a handball. Exactly. I can count the number of times on my hands watching amateur or even pro times that a player gets booked for that. It's usually an attacking player in the penalty area, not a player trying to cover transition. So
okay, all right. This is the second negative situation. It looks pretty negative, Carl. The Quakes are chasing from behind here. What's going on?
Yeah. So it's another example of kind of the players losing the individual battle. And this one actually comes from it's the Quakes basically losing 1v1 battles in terms of this. But this is actually a counter presser moment. So quick turnover possession. Quakes players are central. And then a couple of missed tackles. And as you see from 4 players, 1 player on the ground, essentially. And it's just an easy moment here for the Red Bulls to kind of get on their horses and kind of go in transition. You have 2 runners against 1 recovering defender. And what happens here is you actually have players not recognizing at the back. They did initially, prior to this moment, have good structure, but players at the back basically got drawn to the ball and didn't think about, oh, shit, we have some – excuse me, this is explicit content.
The family show.
It's going to be banned in China now. So they're got their podcast there. But you have defensive structure there in terms of the back, and you get players committing to the ball when they should just be worrying about what's actually behind them. And this is kind of indicative of the Quakes throughout Almeida's tenure, is players, losing a 1v1 battle, and this time they actually lose about 3 1v1 battles in quick trick in really short period of time. But even if you lose one kind of 1v1 battle, it's going to create a problem here. And combined with the poor rest defense structure being sucked to the ball, it just creates a lot of moments of terror for Quakes.
So one of the things that I'm noticing is I believe this is Calvo right here on the left. I'm not sure if people are seeing my mouse cursor.
The farthest left, I believe.
Yeah. He's the furthest left in the square.
Yeah.
So he is so far forward that he's not available to be able to support. And that seems like it's part of the problem right there. I'm not quite sure what got him committed so far.
I think
this is off a set piece or what, but
what happened prior was it was not off a set piece, but what happened was he kind of got drawn to the ball, and he kind of got drawn to, I'm the closest defender to the ball, I'm going to go and start pressing the ball, rather than, he basically tried to join the efforts to counter press,
right,
when he should have recognized that there was obviously way too much space for him to actually close down the ball. It was about 10 yards for him to actually get any kind of sustained pressure on the ball.
Right.
And in those scenarios, it's just, you have to basically accept your losses and drop off and recover, rather than trying to win it. And that's something that is an individual fault with a lot of defenders. Like you said, there's a lot of moments the Quakes have where like a player makes a really good recovery tackle. But at the same moment, you have to kind of recognize as a defender, and, Kieran can take this as well from kind of the individual standpoint, is there's times to, win it, and there's times to just basically recover and, make sure that you minimize the risk in terms of the transitional moment.
Okay. Yeah. If I can
Kieran.
Just jump in super quick, like, I think this is one of the really big Almeida things in general, is like, I think Vanny said it before TFC played one of his teams in Mexico, is that everything that he does sells out the structure to prioritize the duel. And I sound like Dan Altman, but it's those moments are really, really chaotic, and they're either a home run or a track meet the other way. And I think we see this all the time on second balls, and we see it all the time in counter pressing moments, where if we even go to the 1-2 slides before, where we're talking about a long ball, if you don't win the initial duel, the initial header, you're in trouble. And if you do win it, you don't have the structure to pick up the bits. And really the only home run chance is if it's like a booming header straight into the 9's feet, and okay, you're going back the other way. And so all of these moments, it's like, okay, yes, you have 10 chances to hit a home run, but hitting a home run is really hard. And you see that in all the defensive clips.
We got one more negative here, and then we're going to talk some Chelsea FC and compare that to the Quakes build-up and look at a couple stills from Kieran here. But Carl, what's going on in this final situation?
So this one is actually kind of the final one, because it kind of relates to Kieran's points about kind of the build-up structures in terms of the patterns. The Quakes, obviously, they play basically a back three with Jackson Ewell basically as the deepest kind of libero or whatever kind of deep center back role you want to play. The difference being between a lot of back three structures is that the spacing between the actual center backs is huge. So much space in between of that. So essentially here, they have the build-up pattern, and it's basically a 1v1 duel due to the lack of connective, spacing between the center backs here. So this actually turns into a transition or a foul. I believe Calvo fouls whoever's pressing him here. But because of the spacing of the ball, which is it's not technically rest defense structure, but the spacing and the build-up patterns here from the Quakes is basically there's a lot of space for them to cover and drop deep if there is a moment where they lose it. And that's because it's basically they're turning build-up patterns, which should be positions and situations of numerical advantages, into basically parity, which creates a lot of problems. And when you don't have the connections inside to actually create passes past that first line, a lot of the Quakes passes were kind of just, they were risky passes, or they were just pumps forward and basically, just really ineffective stuff. And that kind of relates to what Kieran's talking about in terms of the spacing that we'll get into with the buildup. So.
Okay, so let's move on to our next slide. And apologies for the promotion that was apparently being run by the Red Bulls and during this.
And your QR code.
Yeah, we're not advocating for people to get to 2022 red memberships there. Kieran, so let's talk a little bit about Chelsea FC. So one of the comparables that I had heard from a former professional player after the game was that, my comment was, I haven't seen anything quite like what Almeida was trying to do. And my vantage was in the press box. So I had the ability to be able to see kind of the whole pitch and how he was doing some of the positioning. And Carl, you even sent, I think, a view from behind the flag when I sent it to Kieran. Kieran is like, what was going on here? And all it was just a simple goal kick.
Yeah, I didn't know either. I just kind of sent it to you with a shrug emoji because I didn't have anything to say. It was just kind of like, what the hell?
So Kieran, you're someone who follows Chelsea quite religiously here, and you've seen a lot of different styles of soccer over the years, obviously. So help us out here. What elements of what you saw would you say I can see how this would relate to Chelsea, and what elements of it would you say definitely were not from what you were able to see?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple things. So there's kind of what I'll start with is there's that like meme or video of Pep Guardiola before the Champions League final that came out last year where he's talking about Chelsea and they're so wide with the wing backs and they stretch you so deep with the front line. And I think there's a lot of similarities in that sense, and that you have two very athletically gifted wing backs who can both pass, who can both move the ball, and who can both really, really take off in transition. And you have runners in behind, you have depth. And I think the biggest similarity to me is there's a lot of onus on the two midfield players to break in big spaces, where at Chelsea, that players Kovacic and Conte or Jorginho, where when it becomes a bigger duel, they can really, really zip out of that space and connect with the front line. And I think what we saw from this game, especially with Remedi and with Grey Goose, is they don't have that same juice to really break a big 2v2. And so you have to do a lot of structural things to put them in positions to do that. And so what we see in the first kind of picture here, so this is just a basic build out, very similar to the still that Carl just showed. This is after Beeson came on, I think. And so he's on his opposite foot playing right center back, which we can talk about after in terms of some solutions. But Chelsea run these patterns where they'll swing across to a wide center back. The wide center back will play up the line to the wing back to bounce inside. And really what happens is it all depends what the defensive midfielder does. So here, Remedi is hidden behind the strategically placed advertising board. And he's not really available to play inside because he's getting screened by the winger pressing out. I'm not sure who it is, but he's getting screened by the winger. And so the blue triangle is kind of the cover shadow of where Remedi could show for the ball. And so this wide center back has like a read option if you follow football. Either the winger closes from the outside and you can play the midfielder inside to turn and play forward because they're not really going to get pressed from midfield here. But if the winger screens the inside, you have to play the wing back's feet. So if you go to the next slide, you can see what happens in terms of the available options to you. So once he comes from the inside, Espinoza checks down, and now he has an option. If Remedi has a little bit better spacing, he's probably not close enough to execute something like this. You can read based on what the Red Bull defensive midfielder does. If he steps to Remedi, you can just spin it and play it around the corner into the 9's feet. And now you've broken 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 players with only really bringing 4 deep to play, and you have a track meet going the other way. If he sits and prioritizes structure, you just drop it underneath. Remedi's facing forward, and now we can break and play. And I think we saw a lot of moments like this where the spacing from the center midfielders kind of shifting across wasn't there, or they were too high or they were too low. And now they weren't really in place for anyone receiving facing backwards to drop it off to them to play. And so you end up with a lot of moments like this where I think Espinoza dribbles inside, gets jammed, and they lose the ball on the sideline or something.
Yeah. So for me, like I'm trying to figure out, and let's try to be fair to everyone here. It's week 1, right? And really kind of a brand new system, or at least a brand new major wrinkle in Almeida's typical system. So you've got a number of new players on the pitch for the team itself. You've got Montero, you got Abobasi, who was there last year, but at the same time, missed a lot of games, after he came, due to a head injury. You've got Gregush is new. You've got Calvo, who's new. So there's quite a bit there that is already new. And then you're putting Jackson Ewell into a much different position than he plays, and you're asking Cade Cowell to play wing back. So there's a lot of asks where players are doing this. And certainly there was, USL games in preseason that they played, but first time against MLS competition, a home game, first game of the year. How much of what you're talking about here do you think is Almeida, from a tactical perspective, is not asking the players to do the right thing? I know this is really hard to do. And how much of it is the players are not executing what Almeida is probably asking them to do? Or do you think it's a little bit of a split 50-50 if you had to guess?
I'd probably say it's a little bit of both. And I think what we're going to find out as the weeks go on more and more is how much of it is the players aren't doing what he's asking and how much of it is the players can't do what he's asking.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think with Remedi, we kind of saw this in his time in Atlanta and with Grey Goose in Minnesota, is like they're not super dynamic guys who are going to shuttle across the width of the pitch and give you support next to the wingback, especially if you're asking one of them to drop into the back 3 or you're asking one of them to get higher alongside Montero. It gets really hard, and that's why a lot of times you'll see teams play with a very flat 2. Like Remedi and Grey Goose will sit next to each other, and they can shuffle. One will pull wide to bounce, and the other one will come alongside, and then they'll kind of shift the other way, just back and forth, and it makes that ask a lot easier. So I'll be very curious to see how Almeida kind of compensates for them, or if, like he does defensively, he's like, no, this is how we're doing it. You're going to do it or you're not going to do it.
Yeah. And kind of to add on to that as well, sort of the to kind of the positional stuff about players kind of playing unfamiliar roles. Like there's kind of this misconception that like, oh, you're a winger, you can play wing back, or like, oh, you're a center back, you can play center back in a back 3. Like those kind of minor tweaks, like while they're actually operating similar spaces, is a very different kind of kettle of fish in terms of that. Like I think of like the classic thing is like, oh, this is a really attacking fullback with playing at winger, or vice versa. Like the spaces, if a player is really good at receiving as a fullback, which is usually deeper on the pitch, is a lot different when you're receiving the ball as a winger in wide areas, where you're basically most times you're receiving it at a dead stop and you have to kind of attack the ball rather than running onto it. And I think a lot of the kind of players like Cade Cowell kind of had issues with that, and other players, Jackson Ewell, that's obviously a midfielder to a deeper center back role, was kind of symbolic of that, as well as the kind of the extra stuff that Almeida brought into it.
So you guys have seen the data. I've shared it multiple times, and so has Matt Doyle. The Quakes are better when Tanner Beeson is on the pitch. Ever since really he's been acquired, I think his first 2 games were difficult, but once he kind of got acclimated and figured it out, since then, their points per game when he plays versus when they don't, and the number of goals against versus when he plays and he doesn't, is starkly different. Nathan's injured. That's not ideal. He was one of the top, players in terms of defensive actions last year. He covers a ton of ground. And I think having him along with guys like Montero and ideally Judson, who's not out here in this game either, gives the Quakes an opportunity to be able to do different things, because you do have players who can cover a lot of ground in various situations. That said, Beeson's not one of those guys. And when he came on for Nathan, he was on the right side, and he's primarily a left-footed player. they also have Marcos Lopez, who probably is a much more natural wingback than Cade Cowell. Definitely is a much more natural wingback than Cade Cowell, who also didn't play, but he also might still be working through a bit of a knock. So those are two left-footed guys. It's basically all left-footed guys. So Kieran, one of the things that I have concerns with is asking a left-footed player in this particular configuration to go hiney to the liney all the way, on the right side of the pitch here, because it seems to me that he's not going to be able to have the right angles from both receiving and passing, that same as a right-footed player is going to have, and it's going to marginalize any sort of attacking ability without a lot of work from a 6, which we've indicated is a bit of a problem here, to be able to get out of those situations and progress. If you're Almeida, given those options, what's kind of the best of all the available options here? Do you just go like, okay, the system can't possibly work with a right-footed center back, with a left-footed center back in the right center back position? Or are there ways that it can work and they're just going to have to think of things differently?
Yeah, I think it's a funny one to think about, right? Because of the relative scarcity of especially left-footed center backs are like unicorns. So having the ability to play 2 of them in a back 3 is nice. But because you have Yule in the middle, it's kind of weird that you would have a left one on the right. But if we think about the way most teams play a back 3, we're a lot more comfortable with a right footer playing on the left. So it's not, I definitely wouldn't say it can't work. And I think the way you have to think about it is how you're setting that player up to progress the ball is a little bit different. So if I think about Rudiger at Chelsea, who's a right footer who plays left center back, he's reasonably competent on his left foot, that if he gets jammed, he can play a long pass straight down the channel, and he's fine. Beeson can do that with his right foot, no problem. If he's in trouble, touch the sideline, boom, we're gone. Okay, no problems. But now it's what movements can you set up in midfield so that if he takes that touch inside onto his left foot, so if we think back to the slide before this, if you want to go back one, if that pressure comes from the outside and he takes the touch into his left foot, he's in dreamland. That's like he has the whole field to see. He can play into Remedi if he wants. If somebody steps to Remedi from behind, he can skip a line and go to Montero. He can play a big diagonal to Cowell. Like, you have a lot of options that you can come up with out of that configuration. The other thing that you might see is a lot of times when teams play a back 4, they'll create situational back 3s where a 6 will pop out wide of the center backs. So yes, we see like Yule dropping in between is kind of the same thing, but sometimes you'll see them drop into a fullback or a wide center back role. So I wouldn't be shocked either if you saw Yule flip and maybe it's Beeson, Calvo, Yule as your back 3. I think physically, defensively, that's probably asking him a bit much. But in terms of progression, maybe that's something you do. Maybe you see it situationally on goal kicks, but those are 2 kind of solutions that I can see.
We saw Judson last year play a bit to the outside too, and it might not be the most ideal situation for Judson. He's definitely much better central, but I could see him being a potential solution on the right side and shift what you mentioned there. And now you got to make a decision between Yule and Gregush probably in the middle of the pitch, and how you want to go. And Yule's the captain, so I think we know probably how Almeida would go given those 2 choices, as much as he probably likes having Gregush out there. Guys, this has been great. I really appreciate it. I think the fans probably will really enjoy some real tactical talk from people who know what they're talking about for a change. I want to thank you for being on the program again. Carl Carpenter, follow him at Carl Carpenter on Twitter.
Carlin Carpenter.
Sorry, you're right. Carlin Carpenter. In fact, I could actually just put this up and I don't even have to talk, right? And then Kieran Doyle, follow him at Kier Doyle. Did I get that right, Kieran?
Yes, you did. You did.
Absolutely. Follow him for Chelsea, for Toronto, and just for generally good tactical observations. Thank you to both of you. Fans, as always, like, subscribe, ring the bell to get the notifications when these videos come out throughout the season. And of course, we'll be back with a live aftershock following Quakes versus Columbus, which is a 2:30 Pacific game coming up on Saturday. For Carl, for Kieran, I'm Jamin Moore. Thanks everyone for watching.